Here at Paradox, something that's different than most churches is sermons here start discussions, they don't end them. That's really important. You may disagree with me. That's okay. You don't have to agree with me to be part of the club. It's more, the sermon is designed to engage you in conversation and discussion and to help you think about what it is that you believe and why you value that, and hopefully to become a more loving person. I say this up front every week because there's some sermons that are a little more heretical than others, and if we were to go to the heresy scale rating of today's sermon, it's coming in at about a solid 8 today. So now, if I do my job really well today, which, you know, some weeks are hit or miss, like that's the only way to say it. If I do my job well today, then you will see that heresy is the tradition. And if you're wondering what that means, welcome to a church named Paradox is all I can say. So we're glad that you're here, and we'll see where this sermon leads because we are talking today about resurrection. Last Sunday was Resurrection Sunday, and 2 weeks ago we talked about the crucifixion. Last week we talked about the grave of Jesus, and today we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, which can be found in Luke chapter 24. Now in Luke 24 we read about 3 women and some other women who go to the tomb on early Saturday morning. These women's names are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, and then Luke says, and the other women. So early on Sunday morning, they are going to the tomb to mourn the loss of Jesus Christ. They arrive at the tomb and they are shocked to discover that the stone has been rolled to the side. With bated breath, they then walk into the tomb to see what happened and why the stone is rolled to the side, and they are shocked to see that the tomb is empty. Now, according to Luke, they're not sure what to make of this, so they start piecing things together. They start looking around, and they realize that they are not alone in the tomb. There are 2 other men in the tomb with them, which would terrify me personally. And they look around, they see these 2 men, and it dawns on them that these are 2 angels. And they say, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And I can imagine the women saying, "Well, we thought he was dead. We didn't think he was living. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here." And they go on to say, "He is risen. He is not here." And these angels go on to say, "Go and tell the world that a resurrection from the dead has occurred, that the Son of God continues to live." So the women go out into the world and they begin to tell those who were closest to Jesus about the empty tomb and the angels that they saw, and they race back to Jerusalem. They tell these men, and the men hear their words, and we read in Luke, "But these words seemed to the men an idle tale, and they did not believe them." Now, the words idle tale I absolutely love. In other translations, you will find that they use the word nonsense or pure nonsense in the New English translation. And in other translations, they use the word foolishness. But the idea is that they ran back to these men and they told them about the resurrection, and the men said, "Oh, that's an idle tale. It's hard to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not sure that your conclusion is the correct conclusion." Now, it's here when we read this story that we like to picture ourselves being the women in this story. We like to picture ourselves seeing the empty tomb, hearing the words of angels, and saying to ourselves, "Oh, I would believe and I would tell the world." Can you imagine if I was there? I would tell everyone I knew that Jesus rose from the dead. Just have a confession to make this morning. Sometimes I identify with the other people in the story. Personally, I sometimes find it hard to believe in a bodily and historical resurrection, and to me, sometimes it sounds like an idle tale. Now, if you're new here, welcome. Once again, we're glad that you're here. You are starting to discover why this is an 8 on the heresy scale. Pastors aren't supposed to talk about this part, right? Pastors are supposed to say, "I believe too, and so should you." But the question is, how is it that we're supposed to believe this with such strong convictions? And the church would rush into that question and say, oh, we can answer that question because you do not have to worry about why it is that the resurrection occurred or not. We have evidence that proves that the resurrection occurred. And if you talk to a Christian apologist, which is someone who defends the faith, they will say the best evidence we have is the 11 disciples remaining of Jesus who were in a room one day. They were scared for their lives. They were grieving for Jesus. And then something happened in that room, and they went out and told the world about Jesus. They even went to their deaths. They were executed for their faith because they proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And you couldn't get these 11 people to agree to all lie and give up their lives unless it was absolutely true. This is, according to many church apologists, the greatest evidence we have that the resurrection occurred. And I will tell you that there have been mornings that I have preached that sermon to people like you. But the thing is, when you ask yourself, where does this come from? Most people will say, or most apologists would say, well, according to church tradition, which means we don't really have a source. We just heard it from the churches before us, and we chose to believe it. And when you consider the source of where that came from, you start to go back to this, well, there's sometimes that I feel like this whole resurrection story is an idle tale. I'm not 100% convinced that it actually happened. And when we go back to this story of women going to the tomb and hearing angels speak and then walking out into the world and being so convicted that Jesus actually rose from the dead, I read it today and I think to myself, oh, it's got to be a lot easier to believe in the resurrection if you go to the empty tomb of Jesus for yourself and hear the angels speaking to you. I mean, imagine if we could go to the tomb of Jesus today and see that it was empty for ourselves. Imagine if we could go to Calvary and see the sunset that's in all the pictures behind the three crosses, right? And see it for ourselves and say, this is where Jesus died. And then walk over to the tomb and say, this is where Jesus rose from the dead. Wouldn't it be great if we could physically go there and see it for ourselves? And if the church came in and heard us talking about that, the church would step in and say, but you can. You can go see Calvary and the empty tomb for yourself. We have a tradition that has preserved these areas to make sure that you can believe in the resurrection today. All you have to do is hop on a plane and travel to Jerusalem for yourself, and then go up to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you will find how the church has preserved both Calvary, where Jesus was executed, and the tomb of Jesus. And so in 2010, I went. I got to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is in Jerusalem. Here's me looking awesome, as always. And whenever people ask me what it's like to visit the Holy Lands, this is usually the picture I show them, particularly because of this right here. Now, these are crosses that you can rent at the bottom of a hill in Jerusalem and carry it up to the place where people believe that Jesus was executed. And you can leave them there because the story goes that Jesus didn't carry the cross back down, in case you missed that part of the story. But you can rent a cross and carry it as like a fantasy camp for crucifixion that I don't fully understand. Anyways, if you were to go to Jerusalem with me and say, where is Calvary, or another name for it is Golgotha, we would go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and our tour guide would say, oh, you want to see where Jesus was executed? It's right there. And you look at this and you say, wait, that doesn't look like this at all. What happened? And the tour guide would say, well, a long time ago, Christians came along, found this hill, and decided that they wanted to build a church right on top of it. And if you go in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can go up these stairs to where Jesus was executed, and you get up there, and the floor is tile and looks something like this. And they would say, somewhere around this spot is the very spot where Jesus hung on a cross and died. And it's hard to kind of picture it and get your head around it. And you say, okay, well, is the tomb of Jesus nearby? And they'd say, yes. And they would lead you back down these stairs and across a hallway, and you would walk into a room that looks like this. And as you get closer, you see this building that I can only describe as a kiosk inside a building. And there are people lined up all the way around it in several rows. And the tour guide would say, there it is, the tomb of Jesus. And you would say, that doesn't look like anything that's in my head. That looks like a hut. How is it that we get this idea that the stone and the tomb look something like this? I want to see something that's much more like this because this is what's in my head. And what's interesting about Jerusalem is if you go there today, you can actually pay money to go to another tomb that looks like this so it matches up what's in your head. That's just the Holy Land experience is all I can say if you're a tourist there. So anyways, you go around and you look at the entrance of what is Jesus' tomb, and it looks like this. And it's here that you start to say, I'm starting to wonder if this is actually the tomb of Jesus, because this doesn't look like a tomb at all. And what's this like structure around it? I don't really understand. So if you're like me, you would turn to the church leader who's saying like, this is the tomb of Jesus, and you would say, thank you very much, appreciate the time, I'm gonna take it from here. And then ideally, you would turn to the archaeologists that are somewhere around, and you'd say, hey, archaeologists, I'm a little skeptical of everything right now. They say this is the tomb of Jesus, and we all know it's not, right? Like, there's no way that this whole structure or whatever was leveled, and they, like, chiseled it out of the rock in order for the tomb to be there. That's not right, right? And the archaeologists, I'm just going to paraphrase the general consensus of the archaeological community. They would look at me and they would say, actually, Craig, this is it. This is our absolute best guess as to the location of the actual tomb of Jesus. And you'd say, what? Are you for real? This is the best guess the archaeological community has? And they would say, yes, it's absolutely our best guess. And just when you start to process it, the archaeological community would add a clause. They would say, however, it is highly unlikely that this was the actual tomb of Jesus. And you hear this phrase, and it doesn't make a lot of sense until you go to the Holy Lands, and if you go on an archaeological tour, you will hear this phrase all the time for all the holy sites. All the time they will say, this is our best guess, but it's unlikely it was actually here. And you hear it over and over again, and you start to wonder, where does this phrase come from? Why does it matter? Why is it that we have this idea that this is the best guess, but it's also unlikely? And the reason why is because if you go back 2,000 years ago to the times of Jesus, Jerusalem looked a lot like this. And this was the way Jerusalem looked for another 70 years after the life of Jesus, or from the birth of Jesus on. When the Romans got tired of the people in Jerusalem, so in 70 they said, you know what, we're over it, let's just level it, which they did. And then 60 years after destroying Jerusalem, the Romans, led by a man named Hadrian as emperor, decided to rebuild Jerusalem, but instead of building religious structures for the Jews, he was like, we're just gonna build Roman temples and make them all Roman. So he, according to the Romans, without much documentation, built a temple to Venus on the site where Jesus was executed. Now, those words are actually from church tradition, not from Roman documentation, which you'll see how that plays out in a few moments. 200 years after Hadrian built this temple in Jerusalem, a new man became emperor named Constantine. Now, a lot of people think that Constantine was a Christian when he became emperor of Rome. That's not true at all. Constantine knew that he couldn't be emperor of Rome and be a Christian at the same time. And he didn't want his sins as an emperor to count against him. So Constantine said, I'm going to convert to Christianity on my deathbed, and that way God will then forgive me for all my sins I commit as an emperor. And that's the way Constantine rolled. However, he was also very friendly to Christians, and he wanted to establish Christianity as a prominent religion within the Roman Empire, even though he hadn't converted himself yet. So he made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, and then he wanted to give money to the cause. So in 326 CE, he sent his mother, pictured here, Helen, to the Holy Lands and said, Mom, can you go find all the holy religious sites for Christianity? And Helen said, sure. So she traveled all the way to Israel. She traveled to Jerusalem, and she saw Hadrian's temple there. As soon as she saw it, she said, we need to tear this pagan shrine down, which is funny when you consider that they were the ones who built the pagan shrine in the first place. So they tear this pagan shrine down, and according to church tradition, she says, let's start digging. And as they start to dig, wouldn't you know it, they dig under where the temple used to be, and they find 3 crosses. There are 3 crosses found in the dirt, perfectly preserved, and here Helen says, I want to know which cross belonged to Jesus. And so the method that she came up with to figure out which one belonged to Jesus is she found someone who was on their deathbed in Jerusalem, and she said, come here, come up to this hilltop, to this archaeological site. We need your help. And so this very sickly woman, led by the mother of the emperor of Rome, was brought up to the hilltop, and they took the sick person and they had her touch the first cross. Nothing changed. She then touched the second cross. Nothing changed. And then, according to church tradition, Helen then had her touch the third cross, and the woman instantly got healed. And Helen said, clearly, this cross has miraculous powers, and it was the cross of Jesus. And she is credited with discovering the cross of Jesus 1,700 years ago. This is why whenever you see a picture of Helen, she is always holding a cross. She then established that this was a holy site and built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It looked very different than what you see today. But when you consider all of these things that led to this, according to church tradition, this is how they knew it was the site. Now, 1,682 years later, this guy showed up in Jerusalem at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and was standing in front of the tomb thinking to himself, there is no way this is the actual tomb. And the archaeologists on the tour with me talked about how this is our best guess. However, it's very unlikely. The reason why is because Helen found all these religious sites 3 centuries after the life of Jesus. And she basically walked around and said, can you show me where Jesus was born? And then she'd walk over and say, this was the place. And then she would say, where was Jesus executed? And they would say, it's up here. And then she would say, this is the place. So archaeologists would say, look, the earliest record we have of a location is where Helen marked them, but it's highly unlikely those are the actual places. So I remember hearing this as I was standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, looking for some confirmation that the resurrection happened. And I was like, all right, this is it. This is the best guess humanity has as to the actual location of the tomb of Jesus. I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try to believe it as much as possible. I'm going to wait in line and go into the tomb and see what happens. So I waited in line, and I waited, and I waited, and then finally it was my turn to go into the tomb, and it was very dark in there. And I remember placing my hands on the stone that church tradition tells me is the stone where Jesus both was laid to rest, and also the stone on which Jesus conquered death. And I very clearly remember having a thought go through my head. The words were, God, I hope this is true. And that was it. I couldn't think of anything else. My time ran up in the tomb. They brought me back out. I saw a stranger. I said, could you take a picture? And this is the picture he took. That look on my face is, I have no idea what I believe anymore. And that's why that looks that way. And when you consider all of that, I stood up there. I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, wow, here I am in what is the closest representation to the tomb of Jesus. And it was so difficult for me to wrap my head around what it would have been like to be there, listening to an angel say the tomb is empty. He has been raised. But what's important for us to acknowledge is that we have this idea that if I could go to the tomb, if I was there and had angels tell me, it would be so easy to believe. It would be so easy to feel like I could believe all those things. And here I went to this place that some say is the actual tomb of Jesus, and my only response to this idea is, no, I'm not sure that actually helps. I'm not sure you going to Jerusalem and seeing this for yourself would actually make it easier for you to believe in a literal, historical, bodily resurrection. And so when I read the story of Christ's resurrection in Luke 24, I read about men hearing this story as an idle tale and having a hard time believing them, and I say to myself, that's my story. That's where I really identify with this part of the story. And if you've ever struggled to believe this, I want you to know you are not alone. There are people who heard the initial primary witnesses and felt the same as you 2,000 years ago. And as a pastor, I have to tell you that I've often believed or felt the same that you have felt as well. Which is why it's so important for us to pay attention to the next story in Scripture. Because Luke wrote this story, and he's not done after Jesus rises from the dead. The story next is for people who have a hard time saying, I can believe this 100%. And this story, in my opinion, is profound. This story takes place on a dirt road, and it's right after the verses of men saying, we don't believe you. Here are the words we come across. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus. Now, we can deduce from different things that we know the names of these two people. The names of these two people are Cleopas and Mary. And so this married couple is walking along this dirt road to Emmaus. They are coming back from Jerusalem to their hometown, and we read these words. About 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. This is wild, because we have two disciples, Mary and Cleopas, who are walking along, talking about the resurrection, and then Jesus himself shows up. This is pictured in a painting by He Chi, and it's really unfolds where the rest of the scene happens. We read that and read, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So here they are walking on this road. There's a stranger that joins them. It's Jesus, we're told, but they can't quite recognize him. So then we read, and Jesus said to them, what are you discussing with each other while you walk along? Now this is really stunning because we believe Jesus is the Son of God. And why wouldn't Jesus know what they're talking about? So Jesus is playing a little bit of a game with them here, right? He says, what is it that you're talking about? They then stood still. They stopped walking, and they looked sad. Mary and Cleopas said to them, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place here in these days? And Jesus then asked them, what things? Jesus continues to play the game with him. He then goes on to, Cleopas and Mary then go on to say the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. They then continued, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were all at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Mary and Cleopas go on to say, some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see the resurrected Jesus. Now, if you're like me, you're reading these words and you're saying to yourself, wow, Mary and Cleopas are very skeptical of this whole resurrection thing. They are not sure that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And here is where this story becomes fascinating. Here are two people, Cleopas and Mary, literally standing in the presence of the resurrected body of Jesus, and they are still finding the story of his resurrection to be an idle tale. They're like, not sure it's real, even though Jesus is right in front of them. We then read, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Now, Moses and those books are the beginning of the Bible. The prophets are toward the end of the Bible at this point. And so Jesus is basically saying, let's do a Bible study from beginning to end to try and comfort you, to help you to see something that might be right in front of you. And after this Bible study, which takes place over miles, nothing changes. They still can't see Jesus. We then read the story. As they came near the village to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over. We then read, so Jesus went in to stay with them. So they get to their home, they welcome Jesus in, they sit down around a table, and we read the following words. Jesus then took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And Jesus, who has been playing games up until this point, continues to play a game when we read in the next line, and he vanished from their sight. Would you be frustrated at this moment if this happened to you? After walking for miles with Jesus, you all of a sudden realize it's Jesus, and in that instant, he's gone. And you say, wait, I have so many questions. And when you look at this story, it's important for us to acknowledge what this story is. It's right after the resurrection story. Right after the angels show up and say, it all happened, it's all real, but no one sees Jesus. And there's all these questions that start going. Did it actually happen? And what's important for us to acknowledge about this story is it's a story about being completely unaware of the presence of Christ while being completely in the presence of the resurrected Christ. It's almost like they don't know it, even though they somehow know it. This happened to me on a very different level very recently when I was walking one morning by myself. And I was walking along, and it had rained just a few minutes before I had started walking. And it was like 6 in the morning, and I was walking. I wasn't really paying attention to many things. And then all of a sudden, I heard a bird above me. So I looked up, and I completely forgot about the bird. And the reason why was because I saw the most vivid, the most gorgeous, the most colorful rainbow I have ever seen in my life. Now, because the year was 2021 when I saw this, I did what all humans do whenever we experience wonder. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture of this. However, my phone wasn't with me. And I had to look at this and realize that this was all I was going to get as I looked at this rainbow specifically. I then looked around to share to someone, like, hey, I had missed this. Make sure you look up and see this rainbow. And because it was 6 a.m., there wasn't a soul around. And I all of a sudden realized that this rainbow existed primarily just for me in that moment, in that specific way. And there was no way to relive it other than through story. And I just looked at all the colors and I said, wow, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And then it was gone. Have you ever missed something that was right in front of you, even though it was there all along? That's what this story is about. It's about the resurrected Christ walking with people who don't believe that Christ was resurrected. And what's really interesting about this story is if you start to see yourself in these travelers with Jesus, a question that all of us need to ask is, what is it that finally convinced these two disciples that the resurrection was real? What is it that actually changed their mind about it? Was it the empty tomb? No. The empty tomb didn't do much for them. They didn't find a body and they said, well, it's kind of strange the tomb was empty, but I don't know, raised from the dead? Seems like a stretch, doesn't it? So then the second thing is, well, maybe it was the appearance of angels. Maybe that convinced them that it was real. But that's not it, was it? They heard about the angels before this. They even cited it in their story, but there was still their doubts that persisted. Was it the testimony of others? Those who they perceived as closer to God? No. They told Jesus, they were like, you know what? There are people who are saying this actually happened, but there's a lot of people that don't believe them. Was it their religious institution? Was it their chief leaders, their pastors, their priests? Was it them who led them to believe the resurrection was real? No. According to the travelers, they said it was our religious officials that did this to Jesus. They led us away from the life of Jesus. Maybe it was their walk with Jesus. And when we talk about their walk with Jesus, we're talking about their literal walk with Jesus, right? Was it their walk with Jesus that convinced them that resurrection was real? Nope. The whole walk, they didn't see Jesus at all. Maybe it was that last thing. Maybe it was the Bible study with Jesus. Can you imagine having a Bible study with Jesus Christ? Not only any Bible study, but a Bible study from Genesis all the way to the prophets. I mean, Jesus should be able to convince you in resurrection if Jesus was leading that Bible study, right? Nope, it wasn't Bible study. So what is it that convinced these two disciples that the resurrection was real? This part is unbelievable. It was bread. Bread? What are you talking about, bread? We all have bread. Why would bread convince someone that resurrection was real? And if you go back a few chapters before this whole story occurs, here's Jesus trying to lay the idea in front of them. Hey, whenever you take bread, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This is what will bring me back to life, is sharing bread with strangers and with people you know. And what most Christians don't understand is that Christianity existed before there was a New Testament. For the first several decades of Christianity, there were no writings about Jesus. In fact, the Gospel of Luke was written about 55 years after the life of Jesus. So that raises the question, what on earth did early Christians do if they didn't study the Bible? You know what they did? They sat down around a table, they broke bread, just ripped it apart, and said, he's alive. And the connection between the bread and this idea of testimony coalesced into all that Christians used to do. And for decades, all that Christians had were the bread and the cup. And that was it in their tradition. Now, this is wild to consider because we often think of all the other things that Christianity has to offer. And these Christians felt like all they needed was bread and a cup. And from there, they were just able to say, like, this is how we know Jesus is alive, because when we eat together, something about Christ's Spirit is resurrected among us. Now, when you look at what this story is telling us, it is rather profound, and yet it is the very heart of the Christian tradition. Anyone who eats lives in the presence of the resurrected Christ. Now, you may be thinking, that's everyone, to which I would say, exactly. This resurrection is for everyone, not just Christians, not just some people who believe in the right religion, not just people who say, I can believe this 100%. Anytime any one of us sits down for a meal with another person, the story of the road to Emmaus teaches us that that's all that we need to trust in resurrection. Now, it's here, too, that the story becomes even more of a challenge or more of an inspiration, depending on your perspective, based on what we see here. Because what it tells us is that the resurrection is meant to be experienced more than it is meant to be believed. Whatever it is that you grew up in, whatever you identify in your religious tradition, it's not so important that you believe the same things as much as you experience those transcendent, beautiful moments. That you trust that those are real, and that you trust that those are good. And so when we consider that perspective, all of a sudden we realize that anytime we sit down with a meal with another friend and we enjoy it, we are trusting the resurrection, or if you're from another religion, we are trusting that life is given to us as a gift from some common creator. Now, this may sound radical, it may sound new agey, but in my opinion, it is the heart of the Christian tradition. It is also difficult to do because we sit at a table every day, right? So we develop rituals, we develop reminders that tell us that we shouldn't forget the value of sitting down with someone that we love or even someone we don't know. One of those rituals here at Paradox is how we remember the resurrection every year. We go up to Appleton Ranch, and we started in 2016. Here's the first picture of us all the way back then. We forgot to take a group picture. This is the only group picture we have of that year. But we go out at the sunrise. It's the only time we get together at sunrise because who else wants to do more than one a year, right? We get out there, we greet the sunrise, and we say, oh, it's good to be alive. It's good to be breathing. It's good to eat, which we'll get to in a few moments. And a year later, to remind ourselves again, we went back to Appleton Ranch in 2017 and did the same ritual over again to remind ourselves that life is a gift from God. 2018, we did the same thing, on to 2019, and then things got super weird in 2020. I mean, it's just the saddest picture you could possibly imagine, right? We had to live stream it that year because we didn't know what we were doing. Then we were able to have our first gathering in over a year in 2021 with masks on. And then just this past Sunday, we got together outside and had food again together. And I have to tell you, if you were there, you know it was something special. And if you weren't there, then I hope that whatever you did for Easter was a celebratory reminder that it is good to be alive. And when I look at all of these beautiful people, and even if you weren't there, I consider you part of this too, it reminds me of what this church exists for. We are here to help people see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, in everything we experience, in the laments and in the celebrations, in the fast food meals and the gourmet dinners, in the triumphs and the tragedies. And this church, my hope is, and our leadership team's hope is, that it will help you to see God in the ordinary moments even more than the extraordinary moments. And so, my friends, may you realize that the resurrection is meant to be experienced more than is meant to be believed. May you be able to look at your ordinary dining table and realize that this is where the resurrection lives. And may you experience and trust the resurrection everywhere you go, and realize it is in everything, and may you even see it at your own dining table.